Welcome to another episode of Voiceclub, and again to a conversation that centres on the relationship between psychedelics and society. Today I'm speaking with Nick Wallis. Nick is the founder of Enpsychedelia.org, a co-founder of the Australian Psychedelic Society, and also a presenter of Enpsychedelia on Melbourne's 3CR community radio station. Enpsychedelia is a platform for Melbourne's psychedelic culture and focuses on the controversial crossroads of psychoactive mind states and society. Some core objectives of the Australian Psychedelic Society are to provide educational resources to the psychedelic community, to improve safety, well-being and promote best practice, and to support psychedelic research to increase benefits to society. Thank you for joining me. Now let's hear from Nick Wallis. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me down here.
You've conducted many more interviews than I have.
Oh, it's been a while, yeah.
Well, I mean, you have people on 3CR. I've listened to a few of those conversations. Quite interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, I've just had Peter Shusted on the podcast. I spoke to him last year, but I know you've had him on previously as well. And I did watch that when you linked it to me. And he's always an interesting guy to listen to.
Very interesting, yeah.
It was an interesting conversation. But given that, in a sense, this is... Well, I don't imagine this to be an interview. It's not precisely what I go into these things with the mind to do. But given that the boot is slightly on the other foot here, if you could ask yourself a question to get yourself primed, I mean, because what is it that has you at the moment? Something you're working on that's just really captivating you and you're trying to figure it out.
I have an obsession of sorts, and that obsession has been for a long time around what abstract is. What is the abstract world? Because I think that most of the world we live in, most of the day-to-day world is actually abstract and we don't realize it. There was this great video I found on YouTube that people might have come across before called, I think it was something from Reddit, but a guy did a vocal thing of it called Kill Theory. Okay. And it was just a silly little story about hamburgers and you eat a hamburger, but the concept of it was that there are different levels. So level 1 or Kill 1 is this reality right here that I can see in front of me that is what my sensory array picks up, right? So all of my senses, not just the 5 we usually think of, but all the senses, that's Kill level 1, right? But Kill level 2 is like when you can talk about your friend who's outside of your sensory array now about something that they're doing. And then level 3 might be talking about what you think they're thinking about, even though they're not even in a same, so it goes on and on, grows in complexity. And we do these tasks all the time, this abstraction task. And I've been obsessing over this because I think that we have increasingly come into a more and more abstract world as we have become more connected. So as we have lowered these boundaries between each other, it's actually put up these new boundaries that are invisible to us, that are these sort of neuro-linguistic sort of boundaries, these strange boundaries that are hard to describe, hard to see because they're somewhere in between the language and how our brains work and how our culture works and how our communities operate. And I'm obsessing over this question, and I've been getting into, I'm listening to another podcast at the moment called Occulture, that's Occulture, and just getting into how that discourse works, I suppose, what the occult discourse is. And a lot of it does seem to be around this question of abstraction, of what the nature of reality actually is, and of what we are, what I am, what you are in this reality thing that we're in.
Yeah, well, that's a difficult one, hey. Do you think that, so let's go back, I think anatomically modern human beings, it's roughly 200,000 years ago. Of course, we were just a little bit different before then and going back. But let's just say 50,000 years ago when we're well and truly hunters and gatherers. Do you think that we were living in a world that was more real then, in a sense? Or do you rather think that that same process of abstraction was happening, it's just it wasn't at such a degree of complexity?
Yeah, option B.
Yeah.
I think it's always been a process of, I don't think this is just happening to us humans. I think that it does happen to other creatures. It's just hard to know to what extent it's happening, and it does seem to be certainly unique in us, and I think it's got a lot to do with our frontal lobe and our ability to store information, recall it, and this process.
Yeah, no, I do think that we'd probably have to spend quite a long time really getting clear on everything we mean that might go into a conversation to unpack something like this. But I do think that really that hits at perhaps it's definitely one of the core difficulties with being a human being at the moment. Of course, there's a question of truth wrapped up in there, that there's a question of what is most real. I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about here, is like, if a necessity of our being is experiencing iterative moments of abstraction, at least in part, then do we have to find the right system of abstractions that serves that process of making abstractions? Are we trying to serve something more real behind it? Are we trying to serve the human race as distinct from other animal species or other organisms, perhaps the universe itself? Like, to what extent are we connected with some sort of source of reality, if we're making this distinction between something abstract but then something more real behind it? So yeah, it's that disjunction that people feel, it's only a stone's throw away to the meaning or lack thereof people might feel in their lives, and the challenge that science might have hit up against or posed to religion.
Well, perhaps it's that we're thinking about, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it because I think it does describe an issue that we see, this term scientism. And I really hate this term because I often see it used in a way for people that refuse to even try to understand something, and they'll just dismiss it with another silly word. But I think what it's trying to describe is dogmatic tendencies, and dogmatic tendencies aren't bound to religion, or they're not bound to one type of way of seeing the world. And I think that within science, the way that it's practiced in the world, we do get a lot of dogmatic type tendencies where people or groups or universities become locked into a paradigm, a way of thinking about whatever it happens to be, where they won't be able to look outside of that. And these are the questions that we're really circling around a lot at the moment. It seems that, I mean, as you were saying before, we have this question about what is truth, what is reality, and this has been turned upside down at the moment, it seems. I really think that watching the whole Trump escapade, which I don't quite understand still yet, but I'm very interested in watching it play out, is this people just rejecting authority sources that have been built up in liberal democracies across the world for quite some time. So the universities, the democratic structures themselves, the institutions that do, all of the hard work of maintaining society, and people have just gone because they're feeling disconnected and detached from these things. And I think these institutions and organizations are doing the same back. They are disconnected and detached from the people that they're meant to be serving as well. Yeah. But they've got they think that they know best. They're getting stuck into the dogmatic tendencies of science, this obsession with data, thinking that data is the world rather than a reflection of a small part of it. And I mean, even I've been thinking a lot in my drug policy and advocacy work. We talk a lot about evidence-based or evidence-informed policy, but even that phrase is sort of wrapped up in assumptions about what sort of evidence we're looking at, about what it actually implies, what are the goals we're looking for, because almost anybody can twist data, especially people that are really good with this stuff, can twist their data to say anything that they want it to say and make it look convincing to other people, especially if you've got good graphics people and sound people and PR. And suddenly the truth is yours to mold as you wish. It's always been that way, but it's a large scale now, and people seem to have thrown off more egalitarian efforts for more selfish efforts, it seems.
That's fascinating. There's so many different places or levels at which to pick up this tension, because I do think it's totally right to recognize a disconnect between institutions and certain groups of people, and between groups of people, because they take different views on what that initial disagreement is about. But then there's also disagreements, as we're talking about here, with scientism is mostly used as a pejorative word. I've read decent defenses of it. There's at least very articulate and well put together, philosophically rigorous defenses of it. For example, there's a book called Everything Must Go by James Ladyman and Don Ross. And, they put together a defense of the historical scientific method, but also how properly understood that actually is serving our most reliable means at arriving of truth even now. But it's so difficult to do because what physics actually tells us is so strange and confusing that in order to actually rigorously try and integrate that constraining nature of physics onto the rest of our philosophy, it's something that, for them at least, most philosophers don't even do properly. And so therefore there's whole swathes of analytic philosophy that is within the institution, is part, in some sense, and we haven't described how this might be, but might be part of some sort of problem. But even there's problems within. And so how I've been most, I think, engaged with this difficulty about the nature of truth in my own work has largely been to do with this kind of scientism. This, in the work I've written about, I don't quite put it as an over-infatuation with data, although I think that's actually quite a decent characterization of it. Obviously, we could be more acute. From a process philosophy perspective, it might be a sort of an ignorance of the fact that you are working within an axiomatic framework of fixations that have somehow been sundered from an experiential duration and perhaps a real qualitative source of meaning. And perhaps
that was quite the sentence.
Yeah, Jesus, well, yeah, we'll edit it out. But so there's a difficulty here. If you really want to try and bring science and mysticism or science and religion together, you have to find some sort of paradigm in which the same team is there for everybody to be a part of, and that team has to be grounded in a same love for the same sort of truth. And I think that truth needs to be something like fundamentally a sort of truth about life. But that is taking a metaphysical position that might be entirely disagreed with by.
But these are the interesting questions, the metaphysical ones, and unfortunately, it feels like a lot of the space for metaphysical discussions has been dominated by religions that want to separate the world into good and bad, black and white. The Abrahamic religions, at least the more orthodox ones, which is most of them, have this separation, this division, this world divided, that we are living in some damned world, and if we just pray to whatever, then we'll get to go to the good world afterwards. It's a distorted thinking. It's like, I understand that people don't like using these sorts of terms that I'm about to use in this context, but I literally think it's a bit of a schizophrenic drift that we've gone, that there's a material world and there's this other world, there's a magical world that underlies it. But the way that I see it is, it's one and the same world. It's all around us. This is the magical world already. We never left Eden in the first place. If you want biblical references in there was never a fall. None of this stuff happened in the way that the sort of narrative plays out. And I think that division ends up putting us in a lot of strife, because I think that division has seeped into how some of our scientific institutions operate, that they're trying to be quite hard and materialistic and reductionistic to such an extent that they're forgetting that it's the connections between things that make a lot of these things happen. That sometimes you need and we're seeing it more now, but you need the interdisciplinary and the multidisciplinary approaches to answer some of these difficult questions. You can't just keep making it smaller and smaller and smaller and finding the building blocks of things, because sometimes the building block only works in context with other things. And I think that approach has swaddled some people, and I think that's where this scientism term comes from. The reason why I hate it is because it usually gets used by like flat earthers or other ridiculous like people that have just broken their brain on these really absurd sort of questions. I understand sort of the philosophical discourse desired by it to try and like go, what do I actually know? But I think there's far better ways to do it than go down a flat earth Facebook group black hole. But when those people come up against, and when I've spoken to friends of mine who go down these conspiracy black holes, they speak about getting frustrated with people that have this very hard materialistic view that thinks that everything is sort of inanimate apart from yourself, but there's something special about the self, and they'll sort of almost have like a thinking of soul, or maybe they just think that, it's just I don't know, people that say it's just this or just that, and I mean, maybe this is a deviation onto another topic that we're going to talk about, but one of my greatest frustrations in trying to talk about altered experiences through psychoactive chemicals is when people are like, but that's just your brain on drugs, What a dismissal of a phenomena that is clearly intriguing.
Yeah.
And It's because the question is not as simple as, oh, you put the drug and then the drug interacts with this molecule and then that's all it is. And it's like, no, it's not all it is. I met and spoke with like bubbly alien morphing multi-dimensional rainbow creatures. Like that is not described by that chemical interaction.
Yep.
So,
yep. We'll get to those bubbly rainbow aliens in a second. But what just occurs to my mind there, and it's something that I do think about a bit, is that, so two things. One, if there's a domain in which you can understand the response people have to just sideline psychedelics, to try and dismiss them as something, not only dismiss them as something that could lead to, I want to say a greater truth, but important discoveries about our own minds and perhaps the universe itself at a really metaphysical level. But the fact is that engaging with them, we don't have really. We have the beginnings of an appropriate paradigm in which to try and understand and relate to that experience. And it makes sense to me that there are certain individuals who are more constituted to be able to deal with that to begin with. The reality is not everybody is as inquisitive as other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have to be able to put things in categories if we want to move on, right? And so you can totally understand people's fear response to something that is so fundamentally alien that our culture had to entirely outlaw it. And if you do have that experience, not only is the dark side there as palpably on the other side of the curtain, always ready to pierce itself out if you're not, even if you are properly paying attention and trying to deal with it, the fact is you're only paying attention to the fact that you may have to deal with it. It doesn't go anywhere. And, there's a lot of difficult things to pass with it. But it's hardly the tale of a proud and successful and brave human race to just throw difficult and strange and scary things aside forever. The fact is, we are here because we have the ability to confront things and learn things from them. And so, of course, that is a disastrous strategy merely to sideline it. But certainly you can understand why some people had almost no other recourse than to just bracket it off. So, I mean, when it comes to trying to talk to people who have not had much experience at all with psychedelics and may have just been fed what really are, for the most part, a bucket of lies about not only the dangers, and there are dangers, but they're not the sort of dangers that might be spoken about.
You're not going to think you're a glass of orange juice that can't sit down anymore because you might just tip out and then you'll be dead. It's absurd.
Well,
although that has happened, let us know.
Yeah. Oh God! I mean, this from a man who was just having experiences with rainbow aliens or what have you. So it's all manner of phenomena out there. But how do you find talking to someone who has those psychological barriers of resistance there? Have you ever found any success in being able to have a productive conversation with someone like that?
As time has gone by, I've learnt more and more. I engage in a lot of unproductive conversations, and I'm sure a lot of people listening right now probably have that same experience. I think Facebook has done us in on that a little bit.
You get in there on Facebook?
Yeah. Less so now, because I'm realizing that what we do when we engage somebody with a novel idea that they already have a preconceived idea about is that no matter how much you want to debate it and you think you're logical and being rational and you're using evidence and blah blah blah, it actually ingrains their idea more, because it creates this defensive dynamic, and people put up a wall and people don't want to discuss it further because they've already got this preconceived notion of it. So it's highly emotionally charged, especially on emotionally charged issues, and drugs are one of those emotionally charged issues because of 100 years of prohibition and the sorts of rhetoric that goes out there. So to engage people, I'm trying to think of a good example. So I speak with my parents about this sort of thing. Neither of them, Mum is not even a drinker, for example. She's not somebody that imbibes in these things at all, but she does have a framework of, looked into and experimented with like Wicca and these sorts of things before. So she's got a minor framework, and she's a writer. So she's got that kind of framework that I can start to frame discussions around what the psychedelic experience is to her. With my dad, he had tried something many, many years ago when he was a teenager or 20s or whatever. So he's got a mild framework again, but he didn't go far. He saw some bad things with his friends. So that's his, that's what he's seen. And I know a lot of people also have that experience. They might have seen some strange experiences. I think this happens a lot at festivals where people will decide to take a psychedelic substance, LSD or whatever, at the first festival that they go to, and this is the first psychedelic experience they're going to have. And this is a combination for disaster, you know?
Totally.
Like, if somebody doesn't understand what the psychedelic space is going to be like, I mean, people can have great times too, but I've seen plenty of people not have great times, and then them and their friends decide, oh, well, LSD makes you mad, and they'll make a very emotionally charged decision based on that one experience, that one ill-informed and arguably, if somebody had have talked to them about it, they would have gone, hey, maybe try it at home with like a good friend. And, so you need to push past barriers that might actually be ingrained because somebody had a bad experience once or saw a friend with a bad experience or those sorts of tales. So it's highly emotional. So to get past that, I suppose, I mean, just being honest but not pushy, not being a preacher, not trying to dominate conversations with stories of psychedelia. You don't want to be a psychedelic zealot. We've had those before in the past. I think that is what undid that's one small part of the puzzle that undid what happened in the original counterculture movement in the US and in Australia in the 60s and 70s, but there was a lot of other stuff going on as well. But speak your truth quietly and clearly, I guess, and listen to others about these things. And if it's an emotional discussion, which it's inevitably going to be, stop trying to go for evidence and facts and give them this journal and that journal. But if it is that kind of discussion, give them that. And you can probably have two parts of that discussion, like at different times with the same person. So every now and then you can give them some evidence and say, hey, check out this article, if that's the way that they want to engage, and then give them the emotional story of, oh, well, here's this experience that I had, or, my friend was talking about this later. So it's hard. And it's a longer journey than a Facebook.
No, that's a bloody great answer. So I was just about to go and introduce what you're doing with 3CR or what have you, because I have a question that sort of follows on from it, but maybe you should tell us what 3CR is about and what you're currently involved in there. Yeah,
so 3CR is one of Melbourne's community radio stations. I've actually come to find that Australia has a really vibrant community radio community culture, which doesn't exist in a lot of other countries to this extent. So that's something we should be thankful for. 3CR is sort of traditionally your activisty, lefty sort of nest, and they're rabble-rousers by tradition, I suppose. So I'll just sort of contextualize with this. I started doing a podcast called Enpsychedelia back in 2012, and I did a few episodes of it, and then life happened, and I had to do other stuff, and I decided I wanted it on the radio. But the Broadcasting Services Act in Australia stipulates that you are not, among other things, you are not allowed to be seen to promote illicit drug use.
Okay.
Right? So what does that mean? What is it to promote illicit drug use? Well, in some contexts, some people have tried to frame an honest discussion about positive, negative effects about an experience as, oh, well, that's promoting drug use. So we had to be very careful and there's a line that we still have to walk. We still have to be very careful. This is also, by the way, why most newspaper, TV and radio stories you see on drugs will almost inherently have a negative bias, because they're basically held to that by not only the Broadcasting Services Act, but often by their own internal rules and regulations too. But what we want to do in Psychedelia is push this and be radically honest, I suppose, and start telling the stories of the community of people who take drugs, which, guess what, is most people in this country, most people in the world. In fact, I don't think you can escape drugs if we see that term as broadly as it ought to be applied.
Yeah, totally.
Drugs are a useful thing. Drugs are a dangerous thing. Both of those things are in that. Most things have that conundrum inherent within them. Mm-hmm. And I don't think the answer is to go, oh, well, throw it out, put it off to the corner. It's too scary. We need to talk about it. So that's what I've been doing on 3CR is talking about a wide variety of issues. Like, I'd love to, my passion is obviously with psychedelics, but there's a lot of other stuff to talk about around drug policy in Victoria and in Australia, especially around things like The big issues are sort of pill testing, roadside drug testing, the sniffer dogs, the medically supervised injecting center, medical cannabis. So these sorts of issues, an array of issues that we keep our eye on and keep watching. I also do a Wednesday breakfast show just because, I don't know, I hate sleep, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's fun too. We just we do breakfast show stuff, but it's...
How can people tune into that?
3CR in Melbourne is on 8:55 a.m. and on digital for anyone that owns a digital radio. I just went out and bought one for $20 from Kmart the other day, by the way. Just a little hint if you want one. And that's just called 3CR Digital, but it's also streamed at 3cr.org.au, and you can also find podcasts when I can get them up, which as you're probably finding out, it's a lot of work to get these things done.
Oh yeah, big time. Big time. So I'm slowly getting the picture of what might be driving you. But I wonder, could you tell me there's so many different ways we could go at this, but just very broadly, what's driving you? And then how is that hitting the world in terms of the actions you're taking? Is it occurring at this more trying to affect some sort of systemic change there? Because, talking about legal issues here, talking about how psychedelics affect society, community radio is certainly seems like slightly more part of traditional culture than podcasts are, for instance. So you're trying to hit up against where the actual concrete walls are to having these discussions, and you're trying to see where the appropriate places are to try and move the border a little bit in a way that makes dialogue and possible. It seems to be the sense I'm getting. So what's driving you, and then how's that hitting the world?
I think I'm driven by this obsession with again, like the abstract, the mystery in the world, that there isn't an answer out there, and that doesn't matter, that's fine, but there's lots of answers. It's just that every answer is a new question. And something about, like, the first time I had a psychedelic substance, which was mushrooms, I'd eaten some mushrooms and ended up rolling around in the bush or whatever, but I just had this thought over and over and over, and I think it's really stuck with me, that I was at this edge point, and just over and over thinking I'm at the edge. And it was this kind of maniacal kind of realization, like wide eyes, I'm at the edge of, I don't even know what I'm talking about even. But I think that as time has progressed, that edge feels like where we are at all times. We're always at the precipice of the moment. We're never in the past or the future. We're always slinging through this moment over and over and over, and it's building up. So I obsess about this kind of stuff, and that kind of drives this desire to shift the way. And I'm dreaming big here, so I'll try not to look too like delusional and grandeur.
You have to have a vision, mate. You have to have a vision.
The world is not going to continue operating on the capitalist dream. And I don't want to sound like a socialist nutbag here, but the capitalist regime is over. It's done. It's done its job, I think, in the way that it currently operates. And we need to change how we structure this world. And I don't think that can happen until we change what we are. I think we might be seeing the process of evolution happening right in front of us, that we are not... I mean, what is it to be human now? Is our technology part of us in some ways? I mean, if we can think of language as a sort of primal technology, the ability for me to transmit what's going on inside my brain into your brain is pretty incredible. But now we can do this in this like highly engrossing, fully sensory engrossing way with virtual reality and things like that. But I don't think I think we're going to make a lot of mistakes if we don't think hard about what it is we're doing, how we structure things together.
And if we're leaving something out of the picture.
I think we probably are leaving something out of the picture, because we're going round and round in this value game that the scarcity game, where in many places scarcity doesn't exist, so we have to artificially create it, in which case, why are we doing that? We don't trust each other. And why don't we trust each other? And I understand why we don't trust each other, because, I mean, you were just telling me a story earlier about a bunch of guys who had stolen a bunch of guns just quite near you. people are up to strange things. But I don't know. I don't know what the answer to this is, but I do think that it's important that we bring the psychoactive, the altered worlds back into the equation, that we stop stigmatizing these altered states, that we actually start to try and understand why they happen, not just the drug experiences too, but like favorite authors, I suppose, Oliver Sacks, who has written fantastic things about all sorts of strange altered states that people have had from brain damage or a mental health issue of one kind or another, but that he felt it was very helpful for him to have taken a variety of psychoactive substances because he felt like he could see into some of these worlds. And I think they're a fantastic tool. Psychedelics especially are a tool that can be used by not just the psychonaut, but the philosopher, the mystic, and the scientist alike. These are something where we can find this strange space and ask what is it saying about who we are and what we are as a creature in this world. And what, I don't know, there's some big questions, and I'm probably ranting and rambling a little bit here, but
yeah, well, look, it's all very interesting. I mean, I think the place where we can fundamentally agree is that honest conversations about things that are powerful need to take place. I mean, I can't think of anything more necessary than that, really.
Oh, but we don't talk about religion and politics at the table.
Right. Yeah, that's difficult for me because I've always been someone to talk about that at the table.
I think it's the most important conversations. We shouldn't be forgetting them, and people just do that for the sake of keeping face with their crazy uncle or whatever.
Well, I can tell you, whatever could motivate someone to try and have conversations about psychedelic experience is, I think, a deep point of connection between people, even if it might not be the easiest thing to put into words. You know, there are certain states of experience therein that are self-evidently important enough to attempt to relate cohesively to your life and the lives of people around you as a very basic thing. But I am concerned about, I don't know, I always have this idea that I'm classically British in this way, and it's partly because I heard an international relations lecturer I had in 2010 say that the English way, in his version of international relations, was always trying to find the middle road. But for me, I think it's quite important to keep psychedelics as a broad domain of inquiry that is interdisciplinary and that doesn't get too attached to one or another political motive or religion necessarily. Don't box that up as something that's only helpful for therapy, even though that's seemingly the most appropriate way to get psychedelics with an evidence-based approach behind it through the door. So it's important to be able to have a conversation about some of these things without lots of the other problems that we might have to take certain broad economic or ideological positions about. Even though there are, of course, interesting reasons to try and bring some of these things together, it is something that I do have a bit of
animosity about.
Yeah, or just a bit of concern about. I'm trying to figure
that what you're saying is something that I feel concerned about, and I think a lot of other people feel concerned about too, because if you do change the status quo, which is prohibition, and I think that does need to change because I've heard too many stories of people's lives being torn apart by prohibition. And I think sometimes, just on that point, sometimes people say, oh, we need to keep it this way because it kind of keeps it secret and we don't want the mainstream to get it, blah, 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 all of this sort of stuff. And I'd say, yeah, I sort of see your point, but, you're killing off a bunch of people. You're forgetting the less advantaged people. You're forgetting, I guess, that you might be in a more privileged position, or maybe you just haven't run up against some of the problems that other people run up against. So I think prohibition has to go. But I mean, with the medical thing that's going on, one of the fears that I have is that could it get locked into this idea as this kind of, I mean, I don't think it will, because I think the experience itself sort of necessitates breaking out of the box in many ways, but then there's a lot of power in that and people could put that back in the box. But yeah, it is a bit, you don't want it being caught up in that framework as, this is a medicine for sick people, and then sick people are people that we can measure certain sicknesses of, and, that sort of thing. And then you wouldn't want something like an alcohol or tobacco industry for psychedelics, because then it becomes all this like lobbying crony capitalist nonsense that goes on, which is the crazy game we're playing now. I mean, how would you do it? You don't want it just some of the ways in the US, like Santo Daime and UDV. I don't know a whole lot about them, but something in me goes, well, I wouldn't want to have to join some religious group to be able to experience these things either. So yeah, what are we left with? You almost have to come up with some kind of benevolent, inherently democratic organization whose sole goals and values are using the money that it gets from selling these substances to just put back into itself and build, I don't know, places for people to go and do art or sit, and like a secular religion of sorts, you know, religion without all the hang-ups. But then does that then get maybe I'm missing my own hang-ups? It's a hard question.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the questions I think about most, and it ends up being the place where a lot of conversations I have with people that are interested in psychedelics ends up going. It's fundamentally about what kind of cultural structure allows the proper integration of altered states of consciousness into our current life. And that also has to take into account where our current society is at. And it seems to me, at least, the main impetus of the change towards nothing more than the ability to engage honestly about altered states of experience and how they relate to meaning, it needs to be one that happens on an individual level. I mean, because I do think there's just such a massive danger with one particular overarching system trying to set the tone for how these experiences need to happen.
How the dogma gets created, yeah.
Absolutely. But nevertheless, the structure there you do need a structure in order to orient. I mean, look, so this is, I think, a question that there's different religions have grappled with, and put rather mystically, it's what's the appropriate hierarchical structure between hell and heaven, or from the man on the ground up to God. You know, it might not be appropriate for, I mean, it would be, I think, quite ridiculous actually for us to go to where we're at right now to suddenly, whoever are the 15 most important people, 24 most important people in setting legalities in Australia, if they all just decided, all right, that's it, all psychedelics are legal and we're going to bloody fund it with $2 billion, some ridiculous thought experiment where all of a sudden something changes tomorrow and everyone can have access to these things. Well, I don't think we're ready for that.
No.
And so,
but setting.
Right, absolutely. But at the same time, without a proper degree of democratization of the path towards something that fills this divine part of the human potential, well, I mean, there has to be an element of democracy to that, the path, because if there is such a thing as a path to divinity, just put in a very metaphorical sense, it's because every human being has that in their very essence fundamentally. And so to deny that possibility to anybody is perhaps one of the greatest crimes you could ever possibly do, and is surely the mark of a civilization in decay or going the wrong way. And there could be many things that are that, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that, you know, I've got questions rumbling around my head of what prohibition is all about. Is it really about the things that we've sort of heard? I mean, it's obviously not the things that are at the top level that we've heard about, and we know that it was used for scapegoating a lot of the time, but are there other reasons as well? I get into this space where I'm still skimming the tip of the iceberg on this sort of information, and I think it can seem to get very conspiratorial and bizarre soon. So, you know, grain of salt here, but the psychedelics didn't get discovered this century or last century. It's not an experience that has been unknown, and even not to Western civilization. You go back to the ancient Greeks, and you might be familiar with Kykeon and the Eleusinian mysteries, or Eleusinian mysteries.
Absolutely,
and some speculation that there might have been some other psychoactive compounds there. And it seems even that a lot of the supposed alcoholic drinks over the many millennia had a whole range of other plants in them with a whole range of other things. And we know that there were orders of people. The apothecaries was sort of the more recent ones, I suppose, but going back, I can't think of all the names of these people, but there is this mixing of, you know, magic and science are the same sort of thing. They came from the same places. Philosophy underpins these things. It's really all together.
They're intertwined.
Intertwined. Yeah. And it's only been recently we've gone and divided them out. But, you know, it used to be the magic people that you would go to help do these things. And I do start to wonder, because there's so much power in it, and power in and these altered experiences, and you know, the mystery is a powerful thing as well. If someone or group or maybe just people just decided it independently of each other, kind of went, hang on, if we're having people accessing these states, these places that we know about, and if they figure out how to use them well, then we might not be able to play our little game about, you know, scarcity and making money from them, and you know, essentially keeping your stock to make money from and grow in power, and that, you know, that seems to be the game. So I don't know, as I said, grain of salt with this stuff, because I'm cobbling it together from all sorts of places, and I listen to a lot of things and read a lot of things and almost immediately forget who the author was or whatever, so I can't quote it at you. But there's something else, something strange going on, and the worlds that are unlocked by some of the psychedelic experiences, especially things like DMT, and you know, the whole acacia question in Australia has me really like intrigued and puzzled. There seems to be something deep in that, because it's also a tree that turns up in the Quran and the Torah, and you know, in these ancient Abrahamic texts, where these people weren't the dogmatic people we see today as the majority of the followers of these religions. It seems like these were, you know, the magic people, the mystics, the magi, the whatever you want to call them, who were having these strange experiences and dreaming whole new worlds. And I think we might be living in one of them. You know, it's...
Yeah, interesting. Well, what would you say has been the most impactful or strange experience you've had with the psychedelic of your choice?
There's been a whole handful of strange ones. Trying to remember them sometimes I feel like is trying to remember a dream, and sometimes I'm a bit in awe / slightly suspicious of how well some people can recollect certain psychedelic experiences. Either they're really good at remembering that, or they're filling in some gaps later when they're sober to make it, you know, a nicer story to tell. So I've had a number of interesting experiences, awe-inspiring or reverent in some way, and some because they were hellish and had a lesson to throw at me. One that I was quite fond of, which was just rather banal, really, but I think it was one of the first times I'd had acid with some friends, and it was at a beach town. I won't sort of mention places, but, you know, we've got lots of lovely beaches around. And we just had a good night of, what did we do? I found all the chairs in the house and stacked them into one doorway, and was very satisfied with that. We laughed at some hot dog in some water with one single piece of grated cheese in there for inordinate amounts of time. We walked to the beach and found the center of the universe. It's on this beach.
Look, well, after you find the cheese and the sausage,
then there was a pterodactyl, and I think that was pretty much it.
Well, you know, let's flip the coin here. I'm going to read out a passage that Carl Jung wrote in a letter to Victor White, and he wrote this on the 10th of April 1954. Is the LSD drug you're referring to mescaline? It has indeed very curious effects. Vide Aldous Huxley, of which I know far too little. I don't know either what its psychotherapeutic value with neurotic or psychotic patients is. I only know there's no point in wishing to know more of the collective unconscious than one gets through dreams and intuition. The more you know of it, the greater and heavier becomes your moral burden, because the unconscious contents transform themselves into your individual tasks and duties as soon as they become conscious. Do you want to increase loneliness and misunderstanding? Do you want to find more and more complications and increasing responsibilities? You get enough of it. If I once could say that I had done everything I know I had to do, then perhaps I should realize a legitimate need to take mescaline. If I should take it now, I would not be at all sure that I had not taken it out of idle curiosity. I should hate the thought that I had touched on the sphere where the paint is made that colors the world, where the light is created that makes shine the splendor of the dawn, the lines and shapes of all form, the sound that fills the orbit, the thought that illuminates the darkness of the void. There are some impoverished creatures, perhaps, for whom mescaline would be a heaven-sent gift without a counterpoison, but I am profoundly mistrustful of the pure gifts of the gods. You pay very dearly for them. This is not the point at all, to know of or about the unconscious, nor does the story end here. On the contrary, it is how and where you begin the real quest. If you are too unconscious, it is a great relief to know a bit of the collective unconscious. But it soon becomes dangerous to know more, because one does not learn at the same time how to balance it through a conscious equivalent. That is the mistake Aldous Huxley makes. He does not know that he is in the role of Zalbalering, sorcerer's apprentice who learned from his master how to call the ghosts but did not know how to get rid of them again.
Yeah.
So the reason that couple paragraphs there came to mind, I think what Jung is getting at there is perhaps it cuts very close to the core of what the element of responsibility that's incumbent on anyone who decides they want to take a psychedelic substance has to come to terms with. You know, we've been talking about the fact that these are, if nothing else, strange and powerful things, where strange here is the very essence of strange, and powerful is, at least on the psychological and perhaps spiritual level, the very essence of power. And the question then becomes, if you have such experiences that you can't quite put into words, but feel somehow filled with a sense of meaning to take or integrate some of that experience into a life, well, how do you go about doing that? What should you orient towards? What kind of life facilitates the integration of some of these experiences? Now, Jung, of course, references here the collective unconscious, and it's a vast domain of study filled with the requirement to have a real deep relation to a kind of psychological symbolism and an appreciation of thematic content that I think cuts at this area of confusion about truth and where something like the mystical parts of our world might meet the scientific endeavor. And there's these strange things that are brought together that pop up through and from a place that we can construe as the unconscious. We could construe it as the potential for human experience, but that they pop up in our experience, and they have the power, in fact, to orient our action, but also reveal how it is we are already acting, how we might be relating to our parents or our friends in a particular social environment, how that might relate to certain systems that are mechanically involved in the cycle of the world affairs. There can be an awareness of the power associated with what something like a pure malevolent feeling is when it's attached to someone who's animated by a particular view of the world or a particular ideology, even though that person themselves might think they might be the most benign person. Maybe they are speaking purely rationally and purely factually, but in actual fact, it's somehow there's a possession there. So
we almost need to get into, and I think Jung sort of touched on that a bit. What was the last or second last paragraph again?
This is not the point at all, to know of or about the unconscious, nor does the story end here. On the contrary, it is how and where you begin the real quest. If you are too unconscious, it's a great relief to know a bit about the collective unconscious, but it soon becomes dangerous to know more, because one does not learn at the same time how to balance it through a conscious equivalent.
I think that on that point, it's one does not learn. And I mean, we're in a different context now to when Jung wrote this, but not a hugely different context. And I do wonder about this kind of, you know, I've been thinking a lot about what is it that sort of fundamentally separates a lot of people. You know, we have this left and right wing supposedly in political thought, and we have conservative and progressive, and we love these dichotomies that we can put at battle against each other. But what is it about the thinking? Because I don't like the left-right separation, because you can really, you know, if you drill down into somebody, you'll find like a variety of views in there that you could put in either one of those camps.
Absolutely.
So we're still not thinking about this thing in a way that's quite coherent enough. But then there's a lot of people that don't like that, you know, fundamentally we cannot know if the sun's going to rise tomorrow. I can't even remember the philosophical thought.
I think it's Hume's problem of induction.
Yeah, exactly. These sorts of things, doubt is inherent. Like, change is the only constant. But that makes people uncomfortable. And some people are quite comfortable in putting that to the side, putting the discomfort of doubt to the side and just filling in a little gap and sitting with that. But the psychedelic, to get the most out of it, we need to teach people how to critically engage. We can access these ultimately bizarre, strange, amazing, reverent worlds that seem like these are the worlds of the divine, you know? But what does that mean when you've got to go to work tomorrow to make sure that you can pay your gas bill on Friday? And so it can get people unstuck, and we do see people become unstuck because of that. And I think that maybe it's important just now to mention that all the great talk that's been going on about psychedelics in the media and about the medical potential has raised the profile of psychedelics in people's minds that might not have heard about it before, but in a way that kind of concerns me. We have people that will spend thousands of dollars traveling to the other side of the world for what they think is an authentic experience, to go and sit with shaman or supposed shaman in whatever, you know, country, and it's authentic. Sorry, but why was living your life not authentic? I feel like we've gone through this double speak thing where we disconnecting while trying to connect at the same time, and losing ourselves along the way because we're forgetting that what's wrong with this, I guess.
I see where you're going there. I mean, I think there are perfectly good reasons, and I'm sure you agree that there's perfectly good reasons to have an experience, say, in Peru with shamans there.
Oh, no doubt.
I know, that's not the point you're making, but I think what might be the attraction of this way is that, well, there is a culture that has developed, I don't know if I can say this, for the purpose of being able to properly integrate these sorts of experiences, right? So in terms of a setting that has worked for various indigenous populations around the world that have used different plant compounds to have these sorts of experiences, they've developed a way of relating to this that seems to give them sustaining value in their culture. And I mean, it's understandable why people might feel like they don't have access to a place where they can authentically engage with this stuff here. But in principle, it's you don't need to go anywhere. You've got everything you need right here. If only you were aware of how properly to conduct yourself, which is in the face of.
It's hard to get information, and I think this comes back down to questions of authority and what legitimacy is, because legitimacy is this funny word that pops up again in discussing drug policy and looking at the discussions in Parliament in Victoria around the drug laws that we have, and why some of it is considered illegitimate use to use an illicit substance because there's no legitimate purpose for it. If there were a legitimate purpose, then it wouldn't be prohibited, would it, right? There's this strange sort of thing. So people want legitimacy, whatever this is, though. You know, they want that. That's what they think is the authenticity. I think it's a trick that's being played. I think you can make what's legitimate for you, although don't tell everybody because, I don't know, we might just all break the laws or whatever. I don't know.
You hit up precisely against the problem there, right? Yeah. Which is the fact that actually we are doing as a society an awful lot of things well, despite the fact that we can recognize a number of problems, right? That could be so disastrous that our civilization turns out to be absolutely not adaptive enough. But at the same time, and you know, for some people those problems, and for most of us really, those problems might be climate problems, perhaps, or the development of weapons that are far too powerful for us to use, or the sequestering away of substances that have actually always perhaps been involved with an appropriate relation to spirituality. There could be a whole number of things, but the fact is that we are doing an awful lot of things very well, I think, in different parts of the world, and I think that there are clear and obvious positive sides to capitalism, for instance, which isn't, which there's a positive and negative side of the coin to so many things. I mean,
when you can dream an idea and say to somebody, hey, I've got this idea, it's going to be wicked, you want to help me out with it? That's capitalism in brilliant action right there. But when you've got people saying, I want to maintain my profit margin, so you, politician friend, can you make some regulations that block out other competitors from competing against me, or make my product, give it some special place? That's crony capitalism. That's still capitalism. But it's people using how we operate, our social networks, how we as a human being operate in the human world, in the meat space, to our advantage. We're always, of course, going to do that, but it's where these systems come undone.
Yeah, to tie this back into a broadly Jungian perspective, Jung, of course, being concerned with delving into our past and the development and the evolution of themes and patterns of action, lenses of perception that have evolved or have co-evolved with human beings and their particular methods of adaptation to the world. The fact is that there's an awful lot that we come pre-built with in our bodies. You know, there's a cognitive potential we have, our culture itself. To me, it's intertwined with biology and always informing each other, and you can't really pull them entirely apart from one another. And there's always parts of it that need to be updated. But the fact is that there's a core to what we are, that we come into the world with, that has worked insofar as it's sustained life for many, many, many millions of years, and you can track it back. I think it's relevant to track it back far beyond and far before the time we are human beings. So the idea might be to recognize that there's lots of what we're doing in the world that if we suddenly come to realize it, well, it seems so foreign all of a sudden. I didn't realize it was so strange that I was complicit in some sort of weird... Maybe I wasn't aware of how the element of sexuality crept into how I dressed or how I treated different sorts of people, or how having a sort of imitation-like respect for an older person made me act a different way around them, and perhaps I felt intimidated by them in some respect or challenged, and that made me frustrated. But hey, maybe there's a positive value to be recognized in respecting somebody, and positive value to recognize that, well, it's the flip side of the coin. You have a system or a structure or a society. On one hand, it can tend towards tyranny. On the other hand, it's a protective space that allows the possibility for individuals to develop. Now, what those particular structures might be need to develop. But the fact that there still needs to be a structure and that it can always tend towards the negative as well as it can the positive is sort of like an eternal thing to me. But the question is, what is worth saving? So I guess just to tie this back into the concerns I have about when psychedelics get tacked on to too many other places of discussion or movements, it's like change is necessary, but it's probably very rare that any one individual knows what the hell to do about a complex issue fully. They might really understand a small part of it, and then it becomes about how do you appropriately get experts together and communicate in a way that, you know, and that's that. It's just that we need to move slowly, but we need to move purposefully. I will totally agree with you that there are certain, like the incarceration that comes along with prohibition and these sorts of things, like there are egregious wrongs that are still being done to people. That's a sort of stuff that I think it just needs to be cut out, you know. And it's that sort of activism, if you like, that I could get behind. But it's very low-hanging fruit in a sense.
It's decriminalisation essentially of a personal use. Doesn't fix any of the market issues, which is where the complex questions come into it. But you know, if you just had decriminalisation of all drugs, really, but of course of psychedelics, then at least you're not punishing people for small amounts of these substances and running them through a system that's likely to create far more trauma than the drug itself. And then it can open up the space to at least begin more honest discussions with people, and give people who are just, you know, because there is that tendency among some people to choose to take a drug as an act of rebellion of sorts, but not sort of rational rebellion, just sort of like, nah, like giving the bird to everyone, like, I'm going to do this because it's the wrong thing and you told me not to. You know, I don't know if you've had friends like that before, but I've got some friends who have absolutely engaged in whatever action it was. Like a friend of mine in high school voted for One Nation for the sole reason that everybody was like, oh, One Nation is shit, don't vote for One Nation. He's like, oh, I'm going to vote for One Nation. He had no idea about politics. He was just like, that's the thing that everyone's telling me not to do, so I'm going to do it. Like, well,
that's the classic human thing, right?
Yeah.
Another bit of low-hanging fruit, if we could only achieve this, let's get to a point where it's not considered the pinnacle of the rebellious thing to go out and take some sort of illicit drug. You know, because there you're not going to have any of the appropriate setting, or almost certainly won't. It's not going to be part of a culture that enables a proper integration of some of these experiences. I mean, we're never going to stamp out of human beings, especially in the adolescent phase, to do exactly what they're not supposed to do, or at least...
No. We just have to deal with that.
Right, but that's part of the beauty of human beings as well. I mean, you want to properly adapt that within yourself and find the appropriate boundaries to push in your own life and appropriate areas of uncertainty to play around with, you know, not advocating for like ridiculous behavior that's puts other people or yourself in danger,
like
simply
throwing
because
fiery flares into groups of 100 or so teenagers.
Yeah, exactly. Look, so these questions, they all seem to come back to, I don't think I can get too much further than just attempting to have honest conversations about some of this stuff, and then to try and relate it to some metaphysical issues and some scientific issues. I find it really difficult though, because there's, we met for mere moments a few months ago, but otherwise we've never spoken before, and it can be so challenging to try and take everything, all the intellectual baggage that I come to a conversation with, and all the terms that I think I more or less understand and can more or less kind of cobble together cohesively, and then find the appropriate place to build a bridge between when you're sitting, and then go, okay, what are the things that are the sort of binding bridge making actually patterns of action that we can both get on board with. And we're at that level of, I think, that first principles level of just sorting out how to have difficult conversations about strange things in a way that doesn't immediately sequester who you're talking to into some ideological box that therefore means they believe all of this and that's not going to change, and that means they're going to take this position. There's all of a sudden no dialogue. I think, as I've been saying, one of the exciting things about psychedelics, as well as the issue of climate change, they're two things that have this bridge making potential between human beings, and I could see that being leveraged for a very positive purpose. People always talk about the fact that human beings are sort of tribal creatures, and we could also come at it from a psychological perspective, but there's a unifying element to the other. You can band together and work cooperatively if you've got this enemy. Now, the challenge is, if we're going to take that as a model, what is the appropriate other to sort of orient?
Didn't everybody
around?
think it was going to be aliens? Is that still the prevailing theory? Oh no, sorry, we need a devil or a hell or so. Yes, yeah, you're right. People do like to gather around that and have that other. But I just wanted to touch on something quickly. You were just mentioning, and it's the word psychedelic is a word that was coined by I can't remember his name now. It was in a conversation with the phrase was, to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And it's not by linguistic standards, it's not a properly constructed word. It's a cobbled together of two terms, and it's meant to mean to manifest mind.
Humphrey Osmond,
thank you. We've ended up with this word by sort of historical anomaly now, as a lot of things come along and happen. But the word psychedelic means to manifest what's in the mind. But that's all we ever do. All we're ever doing is manifesting and creating in this world what was in our mind. We can't build towers, we can't build roads, cities, boats, aeroplanes without having first thought of it and started to joggle down some ideas. So in that way, it's a funny thing that we've ended up calling these substances psychedelic, when it seems that we are, by our very nature, psychedelic creatures. And maybe this othering that we do, I think, is it's necessary part of the biological process. We're a limited system in terms of what the human being actually is. We've got a body that's yay big. We've got so much energy. We've got a brain that can do this, that, and the other. We have certain capacities that we reach. I can't know intimately 7 billion people. I don't know the emotional worlds that they live in, the history. It's a huge task, and we come up with all kinds of psychological shortcuts to do that. And I think that's where we get a lot of these archetypes and these symbols and stereotypes and all these ways that we whittle down the information into small amounts where we can then make assumptions about the person that we're talking to. As you said, somebody says this idea and you go, oh, well, that's the series of ideas that they believe, and we won't bother talking to them anymore because now they're the other. That other who fits in that category, and I don't know, they're just the crazy people or whatever. But a lot of that has to do with just this kind of inherent metaphysical hubris of sorts that we have, where we say to ourselves that we are this grand thing, especially in the Abrahamic traditions, where we're meant to be like the reflection of God on earth, but this kind of, from what I read, quite a selfish and vengeful God a lot of the time, in the Old Testament at least. And then even in the New Testament, the whole thing is a bloody human sacrifice cult, that the only way that we can have redemption in the glorious paradise of afterlife is by accepting the murder of a human being for something that I'm not sure how we did why that was a wrong thing in the first place. It's bizarre, that separation. But I think that sometimes we need to remind ourselves when we're making those assumptions about people. And actually, maybe that's a challenge I can set for you listening right now. Whenever you are talking to somebody and you're starting to make a lot of assumptions, especially on the internet, remind yourself that this is an abstract version that you're talking to. You're not talking to that person. You're talking to what you think that person is in your head. And in some ways, that's how we're never ever truly connected, and why we're all truly sort of alone in this kind of dark nihilistic place. But it's not, I'm not trying to say it in that kind of way. I'm just trying to foster a reminder that although we are only ever going to be whatever we are in our brains, we do have this ability to connect, but we also have the ability to remember the limitations of what that connection are. And when we understand our limitations, I think understanding limitations is just as important as trying to break through things, because without understanding where the barriers are, you can think you've broken through it, but you'll just be tricking yourself somehow. Thinking this kind of thinking that we have in neoliberal economic thought at the moment at the heart of our economy is that we can just grow and grow forever. And if people had more choices, we'd have better outcomes because more choices lead to better outcomes. It's bullshit. More choices don't lead to better outcomes because people get confused, because people have too much information. They don't know what to do with it. And I think that's what it is for a lot of us a lot of the time, that we have too much information. We don't know what to do with it, but people love to pretend they do. And people love to, suggest that they've got it worked out, which I know is kind of a conundrum in itself, because I'm saying I've got it worked out by saying that I don't have it worked out. But
well, I mean, part of the process is talking about how you don't have it worked out. That's the important thing there for me. Let me see. It seems to me like a pretty good place to bring things to a close. Don't know about you. Is there anything you want to say to listeners about how they can get in touch with you or listen to Enpsychedelia? And we've been through it a little bit, but I don't know if you want.
Yeah, sure. Well, first up, I'll give a plug to the Australian Psychedelic Society. It's a recently formed, been running about 1.5 years now, organisation. We run relatively regular events. For the most part, we've been doing sort of movie events and discussion events where we'll get somebody to talk about a particular topic. We've had music as well. And now we're also starting to do more intimate events, integration circles, where people can come and there will be some experienced people there. Sometimes experience in terms of these people are psychologists or psychiatrists, who then you can talk about your experience, whether it was a difficult or just beautiful experience, and you just want to talk about it with like-minded people. Just check out the Australian Psychedelic Society on Facebook or psychedelicsociety.com.au. We're going to be updating websites and all sorts of stuff as the year progresses. So I think through this organisation, we're creating legitimacy for the discussion around psychedelics. We're saying, we're not a place, don't try and source drugs from us. Just don't. That's not part of the creating of legitimacy. We're trying to create legitimacy around the discussions and be serious about it and not fob it off like some pop culture joke, which is how psychedelics are mostly taken in the mainstream at the moment. It's just sort of a, joke about Pink Floyd and rainbows or whatever. So, yeah, please do check out the Australian Psychedelic Society. We have chapters in Melbourne and Sydney and fledgling chapters in Adelaide, Brisbane and Perth. And for Enpsychedelia, it's a weekly radio show. It's on 3CR on Sundays. You can listen live or 3cr.org.au and find Enpsychedelia under the program pages there. And, we just are covering all things drugs every week, talking about drugs every week, a wide variety of things. Don't get to delve into things quite as deep as we have here, which I love, by the way. Thank you very much for,
Thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure.
It's not something we get to do on that show because we're trying to churn through things quickly, and we have in mind as well that we're talking to an audience that might not be interested in the esoteric,
Jesus.
sidelines.
Well, I imagine we're going to do a few more of these in the future, and I look forward to those. But until then, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Tim.
Cheers, mate. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more of these conversations and to stay in touch about events planned later this year in Melbourne, please do like the Facebook page, follow Voiceclub _ on Twitter, subscribe on YouTube, there'll be videos soon, and most other places you usually listen to your podcasts. Best of all, sign up to the mailing list via the Connect tab at voiceclub.com. And if you found this valuable, please consider sharing or leaving a review. You can also support Voiceclub on Patreon with a monthly subscription, links to which can be found on voiceclub.com and in the description from the 7th of May 2018 onwards. There is so much more to come. Alright, We'll see you then.